I think it's important for all of us to understand a few of the basics of nonverbal behavior because, quite frankly, there's a lot of junk out there. Number one, it's important to realize that all nonverbal behavior has meaning. All of it. There is no such thing as, well, I was just scratching my face or pulling on my hair or fixing my tie. That has no meaning. That's absolutely wrong. That's the kind of stuff we believed 30 years ago. We now know a lot more about the brain. We have the benefit of research. We have the benefit of neuroscience. We have the benefit of being able to actually look inside the brain as we process information and we do different things. And we can now tell scientifically what is it that's going on in our heads. And that's one of the things that I want to share with you as an educator and as a practitioner of this stuff. The second thing that I want to talk about is that communication is in its own way both simple and complex. Now, how can that be? Well, it's simple because even a baby knows how to manipulate the parent in order to get what it wants. It cries, it gets milk. The child acts uncomfortable, the parents respond. This is communication. This is nonverbal. So communication can be very effective at a very early age, but it can also be very complex. And the complexity of it comes with age, with maturity. The older we are, we communicate in much more sophisticated ways. We communicate in cultural ways. The communications of the American culture, which in many ways are copied around the world because of television, are different than, let's say, the nonverbal behaviors of a remote village in the Amazon jungle where they don't have television. And yet, there are certain behaviors that are universal, that apply to all cultures. And I'm going to try to stay within that realm, to talk to you about those nonverbal behaviors which we can recognize around the world because those tend to be, one, the most useful, but secondly, they're the most important for us. They're singularly important because they span the globe and they truly represent what the brain is thinking, what the brain is feeling, and lastly, what the brain is intending. Now, you have to understand that communication is reflexive. And by that we mean that if you act curious, I'm going to act curious. If you smile at me, I'm going to smile at you. If you look at me with concern, well, I'm going to look at you with concern. It is reflexive. Suspicion breeds suspicion. Contentment breeds contentment. Enthusiasm breeds enthusiasm. And so it's reflective that way, but it's also very fluid. And we've all been through this. Something starts out where everything is nice, and then it escalates. Maybe it gets worse. Things are said. Attitudes are projected. Now, this is kind of interesting. I just mentioned attitudes. We all know someone who has an attitude or has presented with an attitude. Those are nonverbals. Attitudes usually are nonverbals, and we pick these things up at a very great distance. So one of the things that I want to work with you on is the ability to make these observations, to have a better feeling for what you're observing, and then to be able to decode it accurately. I know many of you have a sense of what someone is intending, or you have a gut feeling. Or for many women, you talk about this female intuition. What we're really talking about are nonverbal behaviors and your ability to observe these things. Now, where we are today in both the art and science of nonverbal behavior is so much further than we were even 15 years ago, that we can now look at certain things and with a greater amount of certainty, we can say, you know what, this is most likely what this person is feeling, thinking or intending. And obviously, this is of great benefit to all of us. It can benefit you at home, with your children, with your spouse. It can help you in courtship behaviors, if you're dating and so forth. But as we intend here, how does this help you to get a job? How does this help you once you have a job? How does this help you to get along within an organization? How does this help you to be a more effective leader, to be a more effective human resource person, to be a more effective management, and to just be effective out there with the public, which is really what business is all about. How do we get the public to go along with us, to cooperate with us, and so forth. So I'm going to spend some time talking about the basics of nonverbal communication, because I think that once you understand the basics and you understand what nonverbals truly are about, this will help you to decipher behavior, and this will also add to the richness of your life, where you can go through life and you have a greater sense of what's going on around you. It's almost as if people are now adding additional dialogue to your everyday experience. Specifically for the business person, it's important to realize that all communication is both fluid and reflexive. And what do we mean by that? Fluid in that it can change at any instant. You may be reading a document and you're looking down at the document and all of a sudden you're troubled by it. And this is reflected in how you feel suddenly about this, and other people may pick that up. Or an employee comes in and they have some issue. And so you go from having a good day to now you're having a bad day. It's very fluid, and it's also reflexive. We tend to reflect that which is presented in front of us. If you're smiling at me, I'm going to smile at you. If you are concerned, I'm going to show concern. This mimicry, this mirroring that we share is very important to understand, because if it's not checked, if it's not understood, this can actually work against us. So we're going to talk about that later. But the most important thing for you, first of all, if you're in business, is this. Communication is both fluid and reflexive. Now, what we do with that, that's what we're going to get into in a minute. The other thing that has to be remembered is this. Communication is something that we do all day long, even while we're sleeping. Scientists who look at sleeping patterns can tell you pretty much whether you're having a good dream or a bad dream, and so forth. So we communicate even in our sleep. When we are in the business sector, when we are conducting business, when we're interacting with the public, you may not be aware, but nonverbal communication actually constitutes between 60 to 85% of all the communication that's going on. And you're thinking, how could it be that high? It absolutely is. I can't tell you how many times I've been in an airplane and there's been a stupid movie that's showing, and I don't have my earphones on, and yet I can tell you pretty much what went on in that movie. And then you realize, oh, it's because I was reading the nonverbals. And certainly if you look at a novella or any of these programs on daytime television where there's a lot of exaggeration of facial behaviors and so forth, you realize how much of it is truly nonverbals. Now, if you look at your own work setting, how someone approaches you, where you sit them down, what kind of clothes are they wearing, do they touch your arm when they greet you? How strong do they shake their hands? Do their eyes arch when they greet you? These are all nonverbals. Even the tone and tenor of how we communicate. Do you have somebody that's yelling? Do you have somebody that's out of control? Are they stomping up and down? Or are they cool, calm, and collected? These are nonverbals. We only consider verbals those things which are actually a word. How that word is delivered is a nonverbal. Now, what influences us? Well, we tend to think it's words. Words are actually the last things that influence us. The things that primarily influence are present, your posture, how you present, When someone like Colin Powell walks into a room and he exudes confidence, he doesn't walk around and say, "Hi folks, I'm confident, please look at me." This is a person that exudes confidence, and we've all been around people like this. They don't have to really say anything, they just exude it. Well, how did they become that way? They mirrored the behaviors of other successful people. And these are the kinds of things we're going to be talking about. So we influence each other by our mere presence. We also influence each other by our countenance. Are we smiling when we first greet? Do we arch our eyebrows when we first greet? Or do we squint? When we offer the hand, is it a strong handshake? Is it a weak handshake? Does it mirror your cultural bias? Maybe you don't like to shake hands. Maybe you like to do as in Latin America, where there's an abrazo. All these things are factored in. These are part of the communication process and how we're influenced. Here's another one that maybe you've never thought about, but is extremely important, is territory. How do we utilize territory? Many times in business, we are set off or upset because someone has stood too close to us. They've violated our space, or they insist on touching our elbow, or some other behavior. These territorial displays are very important. How we use territory, for instance. What does your office look like? Do you have a lot of space? Or have you been relegated to almost no space? These are things that influence and factor in. Other things that factor in. Color. The different kinds of colors that we utilize every day. The color of our clothing. The color of our background. Why is it that often when you see people testifying before Congress, or you see someone running for office, or a CEO speaking before an audience, they are surrounded by the colors of blue? On television, you see this a lot. Because of the research that goes into it, because we know that to be framed by the color of blue makes the person appear to be more competent. So these are things that we don't really think about consciously. We think about these things subconsciously, and yet they resonate with us powerfully, very powerfully. We make decisions in our lives by our desire to have certain things met, by having certain behaviors demonstrated to us, by having certain colors demonstrated to us. And that's why we pick the colors that we do for our clothing, for our cars, for other things. We're also influenced by the environment. We look at an environment, and a lot of times we take it for granted, and yet we know that in a noisy environment, we don't make good decisions. We know that when we're in an environment where there are a lot of distractions, we also don't make good decisions, that we orient towards movement, and that is a distraction. And I've talked to many business people who sit their clients down in a room that's surrounded by glass, and every time somebody walks by, boom, their attention follows. And you wonder why business takes longer to take place, and you don't feel as comfortable as you would if you were in a smaller place, a quieter place, but in a place where you could actually get the work done with just a certain amount of quiet. So all these things, and these are all nonverbals, influence us day to day. So we talk about clothing, how we present. Let me tell you something. You may have been told somewhere along the line that clothing doesn't matter. That's just pure trash. How we present truly matters. What we portray to the world. You know, it's oftentimes I ask people in the audience, how many of you were dressed by your mothers? And of course, nobody raises their hand. And then I said, oh, okay, so you actually chose to dress this way. And then they sort of look around and they say, oh, well, what's it a reflection of? Is it a reflection of the kind of job I'm doing? I mean, obviously, if I'm going to work in the yard, I'm going to wear my jeans or I'm going to wear shorts. Or is it a reflection of my attitudes, my feelings, my sentiments? Or is it a reflection of contentment or contempt? And these things are significant because we are, in fact, affected by how we dress. We're affected by how we groom. Person shows up at work, they're applying for a job, and their teeth are filthy, their nails are long, and they're full of dirt. And you think, oh, well, this isn't going to influence anything. It's all about the fact that I had a 4-point GPA. Let me tell you something. It is a factor. It doesn't matter what your GPA is, because they're going to be looking at you and say, why is it that you don't get it? So whether we accept this or not, it's really not relevant. This is what society is all about, is how we are perceived, how we transmit information, and what people do with that information. And lastly, I said that words are of least consequence, and that's the truth. 60 to 85% of communication is nonverbal. The last thing we actually think about are the words. We want to be seduced by how those words are delivered, not so much the actual words themselves. And this is why we want to see each other when we communicate, why it's not just good enough to send text messages. This is why we have video conferencing, and we have conferences around the world, and we like to get together because we want to see the person who's delivering the message. Otherwise, we would just take a memo and just hand it out to everybody. So to recap it, I want you to be thinking that the whole time, especially for those of you who are in business, you need to be thinking that, number one, I am transmitting information at all times, that information is being analyzed by everyone around me, that all communication, all nonverbal communication has meaning, that it is both fluid and reflexive, and that everything from the car I drive to the suit that I wear to the pens that I choose to any other accoutrement that I carry with me, these things will be considered. And these are all part and parcel of communication, including how my words are delivered, not just the words. When we're hired to do a certain job. We get picked up. If you're a physician, you get hired to heal people. If you're a CEO, you get hired to lead a company. If you're middle management, you get hired to manage individuals. If you're an account executive, you have a goal and your mission. That is the purpose of you being in this organization. Your purpose in this organization is not really to be a social functionary. And so one of the things that you have to be very careful with is, what is the social aspect of your job? Are you socializing in the organization or outside the organization? Well, outside the organization, that's okay. There's not much that anybody can do about that. But within the organization, you have to be very careful of who you associate with, how often you associate with them. I've been to organizations where every 55 minutes on the hour, you see the same 3 or 4 people gathering around the coffee machine, and they're wasting time. That time is valuable. That time doesn't belong to you. That time belongs to the organization. And if you were paying for that time, you would think differently. And so you have to think about these things and say, how am I being perceived? Am I becoming a slacker because I am now taking time to socialize, to hang out with these individuals? And what if these individuals are in fact marginal employees? After all, the hardworking people, they don't have to worry about that. Why? Because they're busy. They're producing things. It's these individuals who seem to flit about and have all this inordinate amount of time to talk and to chatter and to do other things that are not work related, that a young person who's coming into industry needs to be careful about, because when they're downsizing, the question is going to be asked, well, who do we get rid of? Well, let me tell you, it's a very simple thing. They're going to look around and say, who wastes most of our time and who's the most productive? And that equation is it. And so when all of a sudden you find that so-and-so has been let go and you realize, well, how did that happen? And you look at their work record and you look at their socialization record within an organization and you say, well, this individual was marginal. And if they're marginal, we can dispense with them. So this is one of the things that you want to avoid and one of the things that you want to think about as a young employee.